Under the vast, indifferent skies of Montana, Michael Rowley hadn't set foot on his ranch in over a decade. He had always thought of the place as a personal exile, a stretch of harsh land where nature didn't ask questions and the wind never judged. It had been left to him by his aunt years ago, a woman known for her silence and resilience, who died the way she lived, unbothered, unnoticed, and unclaimed by anyone's expectations. Michael had intended to return much sooner, but between his responsibilities overseeing a National Infrastructure Advisory Board and quietly directing reform in private community associations across the country, time had a way of folding in on itself. His life had become procedural, heavily coded in bureaucracy and meticulously contained in travel itineraries, encrypted reports, and strategic audits. Returning to the ranch was never urgent until it became necessary. The trigger wasn't a crisis. It was something far more persistent. Erosion. A slow, gnawing sense that the very boundaries of his control were being worn away by people he'd never met. Over the past 3 months, he had received several nondescript notifications. Odd references to shared space development updates, mentions of community spiritual programming, and even a vague request for voluntary energy contributions. At first, he dismissed them as regional misfires or bureaucratic bleed-through, but the final envelope, postmarked from within his own county and bearing an embossed seal reading Regional Uplift Commons, struck a different chord. It was addressed to M. Rowley, guest advisor, which was wrong on 2 counts. He wasn't a guest, and he hadn't advised anything. The morning he arrived was unsettling in its sterility. The road to the ranch, once uneven gravel flanked by overgrown grass, had been repaved and lined with small wooden signs bearing words like intention, cohesion, and stillness. At the gate, his old metal sign, private property, no entry without permission, was gone. In its place stood an arched trellis carved with faux native motifs and a wooden placard reading, "Welcome to the Stillwater Mindshare Retreat." He drove forward without hesitation, but with a rising tension in his throat. He half expected to see the ranch swallowed whole by some prefab wellness village. Instead, it was something more insidious. The main house, an old 2-story structure with a slanted roof and rusted blue shutters, remained mostly intact, though its color had been whitewashed and a wind chime now hung by the front door. The barn, however, had been emptied, painted lavender, and converted into an open-concept meditative co-creation space. Someone had constructed an outdoor deck where the old cattle pens used to be, complete with a canvas shade and rattan furniture. And, absurdly, a small cluster of yurts dotted the southern stretch of his pasture. He parked his car beside the porch, stepped out into the dry, pine-scented air, and didn't say a word for a long moment. There was a stillness, yes, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of intrusion, of something being erased carefully and replaced with polite, sterile noise. His key still worked. The front door opened with its usual reluctant creak, and inside the house everything felt both familiar and corrupted. The furniture had been moved. A diffuser sat where his aunt's oil lamp had been. The bookshelves had been reorganized by color. A wooden box labeled "Intent Cards, pick one per day," sat on the dining room table like a cruel joke. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the woman appeared. She strode up the porch with calculated steps, wearing a linen robe that looked expensive in an artificial way and a wide-brimmed sun hat that cast shadows on her face but couldn't hide her smile. One of those weaponized grins people wear when they're about to claim something that isn't theirs. "Good morning," she called through the screen door before he could shut it. "You must be Michael." He didn't answer. His hand rested loosely on the back of the chair, the other still gripping his keys. She opened the screen and stepped inside as if it were her home. "I'm Karen Martell. I'm the coordinator for this quadrant of the collective." Her tone was syrupy, every syllable deliberately pleasant. I was informed that someone might be coming by, but I assumed it would be one of the volunteers. "This is my house," Michael said flatly, eyes not leaving hers. "My name's on the deed, the tax records, and the federal conservation report that designated this land private." Karen blinked, but didn't lose composure. "Well, technically," she said with a smile that felt like a slap, "the land was categorized as transitional occupancy space after the last regional recalibration meeting, but I understand it's a bit confusing. Let me walk you through what's changed." He almost laughed. Almost, but it wasn't the time. She pulled a thin tablet from a shoulder bag and began flipping through documents that looked like internal slides from a marketing deck. You see, after the Local Stewardship Alliance voted on new holistic zoning protocols, certain parcels, including this one, were reclassified to better serve the wider community's energetic balance. Of course, we always make room for ancestral stewards, like yourself, but we do ask that all returning owners participate constructively. "I didn't approve anything," Michael said, now walking slowly toward the open doorway where the faint sounds of wind chimes clashed with the tightening in his jaw. "And I don't remember being part of a vote. Who exactly authorized this reclassification?" Karen tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to betray the limits of her script. "Well, I believe it was ratified during the Inter-County Symposia in partnership with a sustainability initiative out of Oregon. The collective has been in place for about 17 months now. I'm surprised no one contacted you." "They didn't," Michael replied, "but they will." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, spoken like an engineer would mention load-bearing walls, non-negotiable, fixed, and already in motion. Karen's composure wavered for only a second. Then she smiled again, a little tighter. "We have sunrise circles scheduled for tomorrow morning. I'm sure everyone would appreciate it if you joined, even just to observe. That's part of the practice here. Mutual witnessing." Michael didn't respond. He walked past her, stepped onto the porch, and looked out over the field where his aunt once raised goats and stored firewood. A group of strangers in bright leggings and sandals were arranging yoga mats on the grass, laughing softly, unaware or indifferent to the man watching them with the quiet intensity of someone trying not to break anything just yet. Inside, his phone buzzed. An automated alert from the security firm he had installed 10 years ago but never activated. Motion detected in southern quadrant. Unrecognized vehicle present. He turned and said, "You'll need to leave now." Karen didn't budge. "Michael, I think you're misunderstanding what's happening here. This isn't about ownership. This is about purpose. This land has been repurposed for healing." He stared at her for a long time, then walked past without a word, heading down the hall toward the back door. The safe was still embedded in the floor beneath the pantry tiles, just where his aunt had left it. He opened it and pulled out an old black folio with embossed lettering, Federal Record, Infrastructure Corridor Designation, Level 6, SIU Private Clearance. He placed it on the table and waited. Karen looked at it but didn't touch it. For the first time, her confidence cracked. "What is that?" "You'll find out tomorrow," he said, "along with everyone else." And with that, he left the folder sitting under the diffuser, took his phone, and walked outside, the pine wind curling around his collar like the first whisper of a storm. By the time the sun began to slip behind the jagged ridgeline that bordered the west side of the property, Michael had already compiled a list of 37 regulatory violations committed by the so-called collective now occupying his land. Some were minor: unauthorized use of private utilities, improper fencing installation, unsanctioned signage, while others had weight: illegal modification of zoning boundaries without landowner consent, unpermitted commercial activity on a private, conservation easement, and the misuse of a federal structure designation in public documentation. None of them were speculative. He didn't need to conduct a deep investigation or dig through conspiracy theories. All he had to do was walk the perimeter, photograph what he saw, and match it against federal land use protocols that, ironically, he himself had helped write 8 years earlier. But even as his evidence grew, it wasn't the violations that concerned him the most. It was the machinery behind it all. This wasn't the work of a rogue neighborhood council trying to expand their vegetable garden or a group of aging retirees with too much time on their hands. What he saw pointed to something larger, more organized and deliberate. The next morning began with a stranger knocking on his front door at 6:12 a.m. He was a lanky man in his 50s, holding a clipboard, wearing a polo shirt emblazoned with the logo of Mountain Peace Enclave. Without even a greeting, the man said he was there to conduct a non-disruptive pre-check for the 7 a.m. breath alignment session. Michael didn't answer. He simply closed the door in the man's face, locked it, and drew the curtains. He wasn't interested in confrontation, not yet, but every attempt to pull him into this world, every stranger on his porch was tightening the coil inside him. He went back to his laptop, secured to a mobile hotspot that connected through a private network tethered to a relay in Helena. His encrypted access to interagency land databases was still active, and after 20 minutes of cross-referencing and triangulating property records, he noticed the most disturbing detail yet. The county had recently updated the parcel ID on his land, shifting the legal designation from private residence to transitional use under a cooperative development clause created as part of a regional harmonization pilot program. The clause was buried in the language of a larger economic revitalization bill passed in the state legislature last year. It allowed a regionally endorsed third party to interim manage underutilized rural spaces in cases of presumed absence or neglect. Presumed absence. Michael stared at those two words, fingers hovering over the keyboard. They weren't just inaccurate, they were weaponized. Someone had used his lack of physical presence to push through paperwork that would, to an outside eye, appear perfectly legal. His property wasn't stolen. It was redefined, and that was far more dangerous. He immediately made 3 calls. The first was to his attorney, Joe Barton, who had once served as a circuit court judge before retiring to a quiet practice specializing in property law. The second was to a trusted compliance officer within the National Landowner Advocacy Council. The third was to someone he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, a woman named Dana Miles, a strategic analyst who previously worked with Michael on a federal zoning subcommittee and had since joined a private think tank monitoring regulatory manipulation. In rural jurisdictions, he gave each of them only the relevant pieces: what he'd found, what he suspected, and what he needed in return. They all agreed. The language used, the timing, and the method suggested a coordinated attempt to usurp ownership through policy distortion rather than overt theft. Dana promised to run a pattern scan to see if similar transitions had occurred in other counties. Joe would begin drafting a cease and desist notice for the county register and file an injunction to halt any construction or occupancy-related activities under the development clause. The compliance officer, Tom White, offered to initiate a procedural review from inside the agency, quietly, to avoid tipping off anyone who might be complicit. With those wheels in motion, Michael turned his attention back to the land itself. He hadn't explored the southern ridge since arriving. It had always been difficult terrain, and after a decade of absence, the brush had reclaimed much of the trail. But now there was a path, freshly cleared, trampled with foot traffic, and marked by small biodegradable flags bearing the logo of the enclave. As he followed it, he noticed a pattern: spaced intervals of solar-powered sensors, angled inward as if surveying movement across the property. At the base of the old cedar grove, he found something that stopped him cold: a low, metal structure embedded in the soil, partially camouflaged with sandbags and covered in thermal mesh. It looked like a staging box, something designed to house equipment or act as a field hub. He scanned it closely and found a serial number stamped along the side. It began with UMIS 16. That prefix wasn't commercial, it was industrial, maybe even governmental. He took photos, careful not to touch anything, and logged the coordinates manually. Returning to the main house, he kept his head down as the yoga group gathered again near the deck. The same woman from yesterday, Karen, was leading the group now, holding a singing bowl and speaking in soft, hypnotic tones about reclaiming space through collective detachment. Her eyes met his briefly as he passed. She didn't smile. Neither did he. Inside, he reviewed the footage from his portable trail cams. 4 units he had set up late the night before, camouflaged under foliage and angled toward key access points along the back roads. At 3:41 a.m., the southern camera captured a vehicle. Unmarked, dark SUV, no plates, turning off its headlights and coasting silently along the gravel path toward the Cedar Grove. 2 individuals exited the vehicle, both wearing dark clothing and utility belts. They approached the structure, opened a side hatch, and appeared to remove or adjust something before leaving 8 minutes later. He exported the footage and encrypted it on an external drive, then forwarded the images and metadata to Dana and Tom with the subject line: Unscheduled site visit. Confirmation of off-hour access. By noon, Joe called back. The injunction was ready, and he would drive it to the county courthouse personally. "You're dealing with something bigger than squatters," he said. "Whoever's behind this is trying to establish legal precedent using your property. If we don't act fast, they'll move from transitional designation to permanent jurisdiction." Michael nodded, though Joe couldn't see him. He understood exactly what that meant. This wasn't just about his ranch. It was about creating a template. If successful, the maneuver here could be replicated elsewhere, allowing a network of pseudo-governing groups to gradually assume control of rural properties by weaponizing absence, reclassification, and performative legality. That evening, as he sat at the old kitchen table reviewing county maps and regulatory overlays, the sheriff returned. This time, he brought backup. 2 deputies flanked him, one holding a rolled blueprint, the other a handheld scanner. Karen trailed behind, her expression neutral, but her body language triumphant. Michael opened the door before they could knock. The sheriff cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Rowley, we're here to inform you that, due to the temporary designation on file, your presence may be considered disruptive to ongoing community programming unless formally registered as a collaborator or external guest." Michael's response was calm, measured, and delivered with the precision of someone used to explaining systems to those who believe they're exempt from them. "You're operating under a reclassification that was not only improperly filed, but initiated without owner consent or documented due process. You are on private property. That blueprint in your deputy's hand isn't a permit, it's an insurance liability." The sheriff hesitated, then glanced at Karen. She stepped forward. "Michael, this resistance isn't healthy for the group or for you. Integration is easier when you let go of ownership as a mindset. You don't have to fight this. You could join." "I'm not here to join," he said. "I'm here to reset the boundary you crossed." The sheriff sighed, shifted his weight, and handed over a citation notice. Interpersonal obstruction of authorized community function. A nonsense term, unrecognized by any legal framework, designed purely to intimidate. Michael took the paper, read it, and filed it under the stack of violations he had already documented. They left after 15 minutes. No arrests, no real conflict. But a message had been delivered. And as Michael stood on the porch watching the convoy leave, he knew the time for quiet observation was over. Tomorrow, the enforcement phase would begin. Not with arguments, not with protests, but with protocol, signatures, and a digital paper trail that would be impossible to unwind, the kind of action that couldn't be chanted down or meditated away. The storm wasn't coming. It had already begun, The next 48 hours unfolded with the calculated tension of a siege. Not in the physical sense, but one far more unsettling: procedural suffocation. Michael didn't encounter protesters at his gate, nor did any shouting matches erupt between neighbors on the property line. Instead, what arrived were envelopes, emails, and strange courtesy notifications pinned to his fence with polite language and passive threats. At 6:35 a.m. on Tuesday, a courier left behind a thin legal packet in a translucent folder that bore no return address, only the logo of a vaguely titled organization, Community Resource Access Board. Inside, Michael found a formal notice of scheduled environmental rebalancing procedures on the southern third of the property. According to the document, his land had been temporarily aligned under the jurisdiction of the Regional Soil Renewal Initiative, whose stated mission was to restore overgrazed rural properties to communal biospheric balance. A map outlined a rewilding plan that spanned 2 acres of his fenced-in range, annotated with labels like Phase 1, Ceremonial Earth Turning, and Scheduled Compost Basin. It was laughable. It was insane. And it was real. He placed the document alongside the others, all equally absurd in language but dangerously precise in structure. There was no single overreach to fight, no one figure to confront. What Michael now faced was an ecosystem of soft tyranny, layered justifications, interlocking agencies, collective consensus models that redefined authority not through proof of ownership but participation in an ever-mutating social design. This wasn't vandalism or corruption. It was entropy wearing a name tag. Still, for every invasive act against his control, Michael countered with the one weapon few others wielded as sharply: documentation. His case file had grown into a dense, methodically cataloged dossier that now included internal memos, procedural irregularities, compliance contradictions, and visual evidence of non-authorized structural installations. He wasn't just building a case to take to court. He was engineering a procedural avalanche designed to collapse every pseudo-authority that dared to take root on his land. But the machine was adapting. On Wednesday morning, a heavy truck rolled up the access road, bright green with Eco-Struct Initiative stenciled along the door and 2 hard-hatted men riding up front. Michael met them at the gate, clipboard in hand, calm and ready. One of the men stepped out, checked a laminated sheet, and announced that they were there to begin preliminary grading for the Future Wellness Amphitheater. Michael asked if they had a permit. The man handed him a copy, standard boilerplate signed by a sub-regional coordinator for outdoor gathering zones. No seal, no county approval, no mention of landowner authorization. He refused them entry. They drove off, but not before the passenger muttered into a headset clipped to his collar, a detail Michael didn't miss. Later that afternoon, he received a package in the mail, not from the state or the county, but from a private urban design firm headquartered in Oregon. Inside was a slick brochure titled Stillwater Ridge: The Next Generation of Rural Conscious Living. Page after page showcased glossy renderings of glass-walled community halls, ceremonial fire circles, communal kitchens, and eco-pods nestled along. The very ridgeline Michael had walked days earlier. His barn had been rendered as a marketplace. His fields were labeled forage gardens. The implication was clear. This was not a loose improvisation of community ideals. It was a rollout, a business plan, a fully branded operation that had incorporated his land into a vision years in the making. And there was Karen. Her photo appeared on the final page, positioned like a spiritual shepherd, sunlight haloing her head, arms crossed over a linen wrap, with the caption, Karen Martell, Site Visionary and Transitional Governance Liaison. She wasn't just a meddlesome neighbor or misguided do-gooder. She was a representative asset of a multi-phase appropriation campaign. What began as meditative group exercises had now crystallized into a land conversion project framed in the language of environmental stewardship, social inclusivity, and adaptive living. All concepts deliberately vague and emotionally disarming. This was not just escalation. It was invasion through branding. Michael made another call to Joe Barton. His attorney was already at the courthouse, following up on the injunction and preparing a complaint to the State Land Board. But when Michael described the brochure, Joe's tone shifted. "They've got funding," he said. "This isn't just about you anymore. If we stop them here, we could expose a chain of coordinated land grabs that violate both federal easement laws and community engagement statutes." "I'm not interested in being the face of some crusade," Michael replied. "You won't be," Joe answered, "but your land is the blueprint." Michael hung up and went outside, standing for a long moment in front of the barn. Once a shelter for tools and hay, it had been gutted and replaced with rugs, tapestries, and oversized pillows. He stepped inside and walked slowly past the low meditation chairs, past a pair of paper lanterns inscribed with Sanskrit symbols, until he reached the back wall. There, hidden behind a curtain of hemp fabric, he found what he had suspected: a server rack. Small, silent, but very much alive. It hummed faintly beneath the ambient music, glowing with the soft pulse of standby LEDs. He took photos, documented serial numbers, then flipped the main breaker. The room went still. The retaliation was not long in coming. That night, under cover of darkness, the property was hit. Not violently, no fires, no vandalism, but with targeted precision. When Michael checked his equipment logs at 3 a.m., he discovered that the Eastern Trail Cam had been disabled, its memory card removed, and its housing cracked. The ground around it had been disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig up a cable or sensor line. Near the ridge, a small fire pit had been built and left smoldering, the remnants of ceremonial wood still warm. Someone had entered, not to destroy, but to test, to probe. He responded by setting a trip-activated recording relay along the western fence, rigged to capture high-res snapshots every time motion was detected beyond the threshold. This wasn't paranoia. It was evidence management. Every interaction was now part of the larger record. At dawn, Karen arrived unannounced. No greeting, no robe, no followers. Just her, wearing jeans and a field jacket, walking up the gravel path with a clipboard and a forced neutrality on her face. She stopped at the porch and called up to him. "We need to talk." He didn't invite her in. He stepped out onto the porch and waited. "There's concern about your energy," she said without irony. "It's destabilizing the group. People are asking whether you plan to remain here long-term, or if we can begin the next phase of reformatting." "I didn't agree to any phase." "But your absence was interpreted as disengagement. That's not legally actionable." "Maybe not in the way you understand it," she said. "But this community doesn't operate on the old binary of ownership and rights. It's participatory. You don't lose something because it's taken. You release it because the group has grown past needing permission." Michael studied her, noting the subtle shift in her breathing. She was trying to stay composed, but he saw it now. She was nervous, not because she feared him, but because something else was slipping out of her hands. He didn't smile. "I hope you've made copies of your paperwork, because after tonight you'll need to start justifying it." Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "You're not going to get the reaction you want. We're not confrontational. We're restorative." "No," he replied, "you're evasive. There's a difference." And then he closed the door. He didn't wait for her to leave. He went to his office, pulled out the encrypted drive, and began uploading the full case dossier to 3 destinations. One to Dana Miles for strategic synthesis, one to Joe for legal assembly, and one to a locked archive within the national zoning. Compliance Board's secure reporting channel. He included timestamps, metadata, and a compiled analysis of the server node he had found in the barn. Every wire, every document, every digital trace. It wasn't an act of escalation. It was containment. Because now the point wasn't just to win. It was to make sure this could never happen again. And when systems need correction, you don't shout and you don't plead. You tighten the bolts, reinforce the seals, and remove the parts that corrode the structure from within. Michael wasn't preparing for a court date. He was initiating structural excision. Tomorrow would bring something else. But tonight the boundary had been drawn, and he had drawn it in concrete. By Friday morning, the silence had shifted. It wasn't the serene quiet that followed sunrise or the stillness that settled over empty hills after nightfall. It was the pregnant pause before impact, the tension that hangs between opposing forces just before one makes the first decisive move. Michael stood by the front window sipping black coffee, watching as two unfamiliar SUVs idled at the far edge of the lower pasture. They were newer models, clean but intentionally nondescript, the kind of vehicles chosen by people who want to be seen without being remembered. A man in a sand-colored blazer stepped out of the first, scanned the property with practiced detachment, then pulled a tablet from his bag and began walking the perimeter, stopping every 30 paces to take a photo or make a note. He wasn't local. He wasn't from the community. This was the first sign that the structure behind Karen wasn't just symbolic. It was monetized, operational, and willing to escalate. Michael didn't confront them. Instead, he forwarded the latest logs to Joe, attaching the photo of the vehicles along with a list of names extracted from Dana's preliminary report. She had cross-referenced the architectural firm behind the Stillwater Ridge brochure with regional zoning petitions, land use exemptions, and recent shell company registrations in 4 states. What emerged was a web of interchangeable nonprofits, all bearing vaguely sustainable names, all legally disconnected on paper, and all reporting transactions to a single financial trust registered offshore. That trust had been quietly purchasing in-transition rural land for the past 16 months through a series of arbitration waivers and expedited stewardship arrangements. Michael's ranch, due to its outdated registration and limited digital footprint, had become a test case, a template for silent acquisition under the guise of ecological responsibility. This was no longer about invasive yoga retreats or converted barns. It was a proof of concept. If they succeeded in subsuming a property with federal protection history, personal deed lineage, and current owner activity, without a court order, without a sheriff's sale, and without compensation, it would set a precedent, one that could be scaled, copied, and monetized. Michael had no intention of letting that happen. Later that afternoon, he received a single-line message from Dana. Pattern confirmed. 8 counties. Your site is the pilot. He exhaled, closed the laptop, and went to the shed behind the house. The interior had remained untouched, likely because it contained nothing of spiritual value. Only tools, fencing materials, and an old drafting table. He rolled out the blueprints from the Federal Easement Registry, then overlaid them with the updated boundary lines from the county's latest GIS upload. The differences were slight but critical. The new map removed 6 feet from his eastern and southern borders, just enough to reroute the legal midpoint of the property and reinterpret zoning classification in favor of communal designation. A 6-foot line had been the pivot point for an attempted seizure worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the true midpoint of the conflict of the war came that evening when Michael received a call not from Joe or Dana or the Compliance Board, but from a name he hadn't seen in 3 years, Peter Kells, a former legislative aide who now served on the advisory board of the governor's Rural Engagement Initiative. His voice was low, calculated, and without any preamble. You're not just in the way, Michael. You're on a list, and they're betting you'll blink. I'm not blinking. Michael said, staring at the smoldering horizon beyond the fence line. "I'm documenting." "I know. That's why I'm calling. There's a session Monday where they'll finalize the grant rollouts tied to your land code." If the paperwork isn't challenged, that's your last window." "I already filed the injunction." "It's been challenged, on procedural grounds." "Let me guess, lack of demonstrated harm." "Exactly, because technically, nothing's been built, just reassigned, reimagined, repurposed." The language was so soft it could rot the spine. Michael thanked him for the warning and ended the call. He didn't feel angry. He felt cold, cold enough to act without hesitation. At sunset, he walked the fence line again, checking the sensors and relays, inspecting the ground for fresh tracks. Near the southern edge, where the ritual stones had been laid days earlier, he found something new. A fresh wooden post, still damp from paint, bearing a laminated sign. It read, "Future site of the Stillwater Ridge Reflection Pavilion. Projected opening, Spring 2026. Community supported. Harmony engineered." He photographed it, documented its placement, and then calmly uprooted the post, tossing it into the back of his truck. He wasn't erasing anything, just removing evidence of premature victory. The fight wasn't over, but he had drawn the front line. That night, as he sat in the study cataloging footage and scanning documents into the encrypted drive, a knock sounded at the door. Firm, direct, not the meandering arrival of a peace seeker or the subtle tap of a coordinator. He opened it to find Karen standing alone, arms crossed, eyes alert. "We need to talk," she said, voice sharper than ever before. "Then talk." She stepped inside without waiting, not bothering to offer a reason. "You're interfering with a process bigger than either of us. You think this land is about heritage and paperwork. It's not. It's about relevance. You left it. We made it matter again." Michael didn't answer. He watched her pace across the room, her posture more rigid, less floaty. She wasn't acting anymore. "We have contracts, influence. The board has friends higher than you think. You're not a landowner anymore. You're a placeholder in a new model." "You came to threaten me?" "I came to warn you. After Monday, your documents won't matter." Michael stepped forward just enough to interrupt her path. "And you think I waited this long to depend on documents?" She held his gaze and, for the first time, didn't smile. "You're making a mistake," she said. "No," he replied. "You are. You mistook absence for permission, and relevance for authority." She left without another word, her boots echoing against the porch steps. Michael locked the door, turned off the light, and returned to his desk. The midpoint had passed. There would be no more warnings, no more testing boundaries. Only enforcement. Only exposure. And when systems lose their camouflage, the only thing left is the truth, and the people willing to use it. The morning after Karen's visit, Michael woke earlier than usual. Not out of habit or anxiety, but from the sense that something in the air had changed. Subtle, invisible, but unmistakably off. The kind of shift a man feels when he's walked the same land for years and notices that the birds are quieter than they should be, or that the wind cuts a little differently across the ridge. He dressed without checking his phone or emails, slid his sidearm into the back of his belt, just a reflex now, and stepped out onto the porch. Everything looked the same. Dew on the fence posts, haze rising off the fields, distant silhouettes of yurts dotting the southern property line. But it wasn't the landscape that had shifted. It was posture, timing, intent. An hour later, his lawyer called. Joe's tone wasn't sharp, but it was tight, too composed for casual conversation. "You've been named in a complaint," he said, "filed by the interim council claiming obstruction of public access and misuse of ecological space." Michael let the words settle without reacting. He wasn't surprised. They'd escalated from courtesy notifications to procedural overrides. Now came the stage of weaponized paperwork. "Filed with the county?" "No," Joe answered. "Filed with the state mediator. It's a petition for expedited arbitration under the Rural Resilience Clause." That clause had been buried deep in a state funding bill the year prior, meant to protect land intended for cooperative development in post-industrial counties. Michael knew it well. He had personally fought to prevent it from being abused by opportunistic development councils. Ironically, his own land had now become the stage for the very misuse he'd tried to prevent. The arbitration process wasn't a trial. It wasn't even a hearing. It was a closed-door administrative session, typically resolved within 10 days, where evidence wasn't challenged so much as ranked for social merit and alignment with public interest models. "Then we move fast," Michael said. "File our own petition, challenge jurisdiction, submit the dossier, push for federal protection review under the Land Use Integrity Clause." "Already in motion," Joe replied. "But there's something else. A motion has been introduced in the County Planning Board to freeze your utility access pending mediation outcome." "They're trying to starve me off the land," Michael said. "Not you," Joe corrected. "The concept of you. A private owner. They're beta testing asset transition through infrastructure leverage." It was as calculated as it was cowardly. Michael spent the rest of the day filing supplemental documentation, updating his data packets, and rerouting his utilities through backup systems he had quietly installed after his second week back on the land. He hadn't planned for war, but he had known that compromise would always be a luxury, not a guarantee. Still, the deeper concern wasn't the arbitration or even the coordinated attack on his access. It was the cultural momentum that had formed around Karen's operation. By sundown, he noticed something that unsettled him more than any zoning infraction. The fence posts around the lower ridge had been painted. Not marked. Not vandalized. Painted in earth tones, with symbols he didn't recognize. Abstract spirals, open-eye motifs, and minimalist figures arranged in rows. Each faced inward, toward the center of his property. He documented everything: angle, placement, dimensions. Not because he feared the symbols, but because he understood their function. They weren't aesthetic. They were claims. Visual declarations of territorial ritual. This wasn't just a procedural takeover. It was ideological occupation. And then came the media. On the following Tuesday, a van arrived bearing the insignia of a regional ecology docuseries, produced by an independent studio based out of Portland. The crew, 2 camera operators, a soft-spoken interviewer, and a production assistant, set up at the edge of the yoga deck with Karen standing dead center, arms open like a saint mid-testimony. Michael watched from the porch, unmoving. He hadn't given consent to film on his land, nor had anyone approached him to discuss the narrative being constructed around his presence. Yet, there it was. Karen speaking into a microphone about restorative occupancy, non-ownership-based land relations, and the importance of protecting communal healing spaces from reactive, regressive stakeholders. He didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew how it would be framed: the enlightened community repurposing neglected land, obstructed by a shadowy, stubborn landowner clinging to outdated models of possession. He made 2 calls. The first was to Dana, requesting immediate media surveillance protocol, name tracking, footage requests, and public sentiment scanning. The second was to a logistics firm in Billings with whom he had done discreet work in the past, specializing in rapid site demobilization. "I don't want violence," he said clearly. "I want reversal, visual rollback. I want their presence reduced to paperwork, not memory." "Understood," came the reply. That night, without fanfare, he received an encrypted drop from Dana. Inside were screenshots of internal communications from the production company, obtained legally through media access requests. One line stood out: "Narrative is ready, just waiting for Escalation to wrap Act 3. They weren't filming what happened. They were filming what they hoped would happen. Conflict, resistance, a confrontation, something cinematic, something that justified their angle and dehumanized the man standing in their way. That night, Michael wrote a formal letter of cease and desist to the production team, then had it hand-delivered by a licensed process server the following morning, documented with time-stamped video. But the escalation wasn't limited to media narratives. Within 48 hours, a public petition appeared online, hosted on a major platform with signatures from across the country. It demanded the reinstatement of communal stewardship access to Stillwater Ridge, citing Michael as a latent monopolizer of sacred ecological zones and a symbol of post-industrial stagnation. Thousands of signatures poured in, most of them from people who had never set foot in Montana, let alone walked his fields. The digital mob had arrived, waving the flags of equity, justice, and progress, unaware they were carrying the banners of a real estate operation disguised as spirituality. Michael didn't flinch. Instead, he requested a temporary motion from the state court for emergency injunctive relief based on digital defamation tied to illegal zoning operations. Joe handled the paperwork. Dana submitted a classified anomaly report to the Federal Environmental Ethics Committee citing misuse of federal conservation zones for unregistered commerce. But it was the moment Karen approached him again, unannounced, mid-morning in front of 3 witnesses, that marked the final transformation of their standoff. She didn't bring documents. She didn't bring slogans. She brought a proposition. "You know, it can't go back to the way it was," she said softly, standing a few feet from the edge of the porch. "No," Michael replied, "but it can be returned to what it was meant to be." She tilted her head. "What if we rename you?" He stared. "You become a symbolic figure, not a barrier. You let us use the story. You reclaim your narrative as someone who evolved. You don't lose the land. You become part of the transformation." Michael exhaled slowly, not laughing, not angry, just absorbing the surreal boldness of it. "You want me to narrate my own erasure?" "No," she said. "I want you to let go of the binary." He turned and walked back into the house without another word. Later that day, the production crew was escorted off the property perimeter by 2 legal observers and an independent compliance monitor from Helena. A drone flew overhead, briefly. Michael tracked its path, documented the operator, and filed a remote surveillance breach report. The next morning, the yurts were empty. The yoga deck was gone. The signs were removed. No confrontation, no announcement. Because sometimes the strongest response is to deny the spectacle, to refuse to perform, to counter their story not with another show, but with silence and structure. He sat at the window that night watching the stars return to their place over the ridgeline. They had come for the land, then the narrative, then the identity. He hadn't surrendered any of them. But the war wasn't over. Now came the reckoning. By the following Monday, the land was quiet again. But it wasn't peace. It was aftermath, a false pause held in place by bureaucracy's slow turn and the mechanical calm of people waiting behind their desks, calculating whether the storm had passed or only changed shape. Michael knew better than to assume retreat meant surrender. If anything, their absence was part of the strategy, designed to shift pressure away from the physical site and onto the institutional plane, where influence moved unseen and in whispers. His injunction had halted construction, stalled utility interference, and imposed temporary restraining parameters around the property's contested areas. But it had also triggered automated reviews, media inquiries, and a slow bureaucratic unwind that wouldn't stop with a simple court order. Once a case entered the system with this level of visibility, it bred its own inertia. Committees would form, audits would begin. Allegiances would shift under pressure from donors, governors, board members, and if he faltered in any step, if he missed a reply, overlooked a procedural clause, or allowed narrative to outpace evidence, the system wouldn't correct itself. It would collapse the case under its own weight. Michael had no intention of letting that happen. That morning, he met with Joe and Helena, not by phone, not by encrypted video, but in person, because some discussions required eye contact and physical presence to be taken seriously. They sat in the back of a quiet legal co-op, surrounded by filing cabinets and high-backed chairs that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Joe laid out the remaining pressure points. The arbitration hearing was still scheduled, despite the injunction. The trust behind the repurposing plan had submitted a secondary claim, not for ownership, but for stewardship access, arguing that the cultural and ecological development taking place on the property was too advanced and too symbolically integrated to be reversed without doing communal harm. It was an absurd argument, legally speaking, but it wasn't meant for the courts. It was meant for the public eye, for journalists, policymakers, and risk-averse council members who feared being labeled obstructionist. They're not trying to win the property, Joe said. They're trying to win the narrative. If they control the perception, they can frame your ownership as selfishness, your resistance as backwardness, and your documents as noise. Michael nodded slowly, folding the paper in front of him. Then we change the audience. What do you mean? I mean, we escalate it. Not in the media, not on their turf. We take it to the Federal Land Ethics Board directly. Joe leaned back. You're invoking precedent. I'm invoking review. We have the materials. We have documentation of land misuse, unauthorized surveillance, asset funneling through social camouflage, and procedural fraud. Let them explain how they reclassified an easement property without federal concurrence. Joe didn't argue. He simply began drafting the paperwork. That afternoon, Michael returned to the ranch. He took no calls, answered no messages. Instead, he walked the land slowly, starting at the old cedar grove and circling his property as if reacquainting himself not just with the geography, but with the burden. He stopped at the spot where the pavilion sign had been erected, then torn down. He passed the field where the yurts had stood, now flattened with uneven patches of grass where the soil had not yet recovered. He reached the barn, still reeking faintly of incense despite the removal of all furniture and fabrics, and stepped inside. Everything had been stripped, but the silence now felt heavier. Not emptiness, but memory. When he emerged, a black sedan was parked in the driveway. Karen stood beside it. Not in linen, not in anything resembling retreat attire. She wore a tailored jacket, plain slacks, no accessories. Her expression was hard. Not cold, not angry, just stripped of all softness. "You made it farther than most," she said, not moving toward him. Michael didn't reply. "You know this isn't the end. It's just the reset. We'll restructure, rebrand, wait for the system to rotate. These things are iterative." "I know," he said calmly. "That's why I didn't build my case for a moment. I built it for a pattern." She tilted her head. "You really think any of this stops because of your papers? You think people care who owns what anymore?" "No," he said, "but they still care who lies about it." There was a long pause between them, filled only by the sound of wind crossing the fields. "Whatever happens next," she said, "it will be slow. You won't see it. It'll happen in places you don't check, in forms you don't read. People like me don't disappear. We adapt." "I know," he said again. "But now I have your blueprints." She smiled faintly, not warmly, not mockingly, just with the acknowledgement of a worthy adversary. Then she turned, stepped into the car, and drove off without another word. That night, Michael filed the federal petition, The complaint was 168 pages long, cross-referenced with internal communications, regulatory filings, land overlays, forensic analysis of server use, and metadata logs from drone footage, surveillance anomalies, and zoning council transcriptions. Dana's team submitted a matching record to the National Integrity Clearinghouse. Joe handed off the legal baton to a federal liaison with prior experience in land seizure investigations. Within 48 hours, the trust managing the Stillwater project was subpoenaed. Within 72, the site was frozen. Again. This time, not by local injunction, but federal audit order. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak to the press. He simply resumed his daily walks, reinforced the perimeter with new equipment, and restored the property's federal tags to every structure and trail marker, replacing Karen's ideology with ironclad compliance. He wasn't reclaiming his land. He was reinforcing its reality. By the end of the week, reports began surfacing about other wellness retreats undergoing quiet inspection. Some voluntarily dissolved, others quietly absorbed into local zoning corrections. The movement that once cloaked itself in healing vocabulary now began to retreat into silence, unable to explain where the money went, how the transitions were decided, or why no one could name the last owner with certainty. Stillwater Ridge remained untouched. Michael, for his part, simply documented everything, because truth doesn't need applause. It needs record. 3 months later, the land had settled, not in the sense that the grass grew taller or the birds returned in greater number, though both were true. It had settled in tone, in posture, in that quiet behavioral shift a property makes when it no longer feels the presence of imposition. Michael stood at the southern fence line, eyes scanning the far slope where the ceremonial markers had once been. There was no trace of them now. The soil bore only the subtle scars of disturbance, discolored grass patches, faint indentations from tent pegs, a few stubborn lavender sprouts clinging to the edge of the old deck foundation. But the noise was gone. The cadence of human ambition, that hum of coordinated chaos wrapped in noble phrasing, had finally lifted. The Federal Review had completed without fanfare. The report, hundreds of pages thick, confirmed what Michael and his team had already demonstrated. Unauthorized asset transition protocols, illegal designation layering, misuse of regional cooperative bylaws to facilitate land conversion through administrative sleight of hand. The trust behind Stillwater had dissolved quietly after the audit, and the shell organizations beneath it collapsed in sequence like scaffolding pulled from beneath an unfinished stage. No press releases were issued. No names were formally reprimanded. But the infrastructure, legal, procedural, financial, had been exposed and decommissioned, and exposure, in Michael's world, was the same thing as annihilation. The ranch, once a contested landscape of symbolic conflict, had returned to silence. But not stasis. Michael didn't rebuild the yoga deck or convert the barn back into anything. He left it empty, save for the structural reinforcements and new fencing around the perimeter. He didn't post new warning signs or repaint the entrance gate. Instead, he filed new land reports with stricter classifications, re-established its status as a protected easement under advanced surveillance zones, and quietly registered the parcel for long-term environmental research designation. It would no longer be eligible for reassignment or repurposing under any development scheme. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a boundary marker, a line in the sand not just for him, but for others like him across the country who might be watching, wondering what could be done if the same process began on their land. People wrote to him. Some letters came handwritten, mostly from older landowners who had fought similar battles in silence. Others arrived through legal channels, petitions, inquiries, quiet requests for procedural templates. Michael never advertised what had happened. He didn't post a video or write an article, but the story spread through the channels that still mattered: compliance boards, legal consortiums, landowner councils. The ranch had become an example not of victory, but of defense. Calm, deliberate, sustained. Karen never returned. Her name appeared once more, briefly, in a conference roster attached to a different initiative in the Southwest, but it was clear that her influence had diminished. The model she helped execute had been exposed as vulnerable, and in that world, exposure was as good as failure. Michael didn't hunt her down, didn't follow her moves. He didn't care where she went. The threat hadn't been personal. It had been structural. And now, the structure was gone. He spent his days walking the land with intention, not vigilance. He cleared trails not for surveillance but for maintenance. He restored irrigation lines, rerouted runoff from the western slope, reseeded the northern pasture with native grass blends that hadn't grown there in years. He didn't rebuild a life. He preserved one. And in that preservation he found something that no resolution could fake. Stillness. Not the kind sold on brochures or spoken through mantras, but the kind that comes when ownership is no longer a fight, and purpose is no longer reactive. On the last day of September, he stood on the porch at dusk, watching the sun bleed into the hills, his hands resting against the old rail that his aunt had installed decades ago. The boards had been sanded and retreated, but he had left one section untouched, the one she always leaned on. It bore her initials, burned into the wood with a branding iron. Faint now, but still there. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The land had never needed explanation. It had only needed protection.